final, PFA President and Chief Adjudicator of the debate portion of this tournament, Ms. Helen Kolianis.
Well, welcome to the debate final. We've had some wonderful debates during this tournament, and congratulations to all debaters. You did a great job. First of all, I'm going to introduce the judges of this debate. The chair of the panel is going to be Miss Kalina Vasley, who's coach of the national team. The member of the PFA board, Mr. John Lassaras. From the debate tab room, we have Ms. Lana de Beer-Hurt and Dimitris Kotsias. We have Ms. Ilyana Puri, former debate coach of the national team. And we have the head of the Impromptu Motions Committee, Mr. Albert Furnace. And coach and former debater, Alex Slettes. Thank you very much. So the debate, the motion they're going to debate is this House believes that national security takes precedent over civil rights. And the proposition team is from St. Lawrence. The speakers are going to be Amy Norton-Rambo, Angelo Calibos, and Nicholas Roberts. The opposition team is from St. Catherine's. And the next speakers are going to be Tanya Sheenan, Vinakos Sotiropoulos, We're going to have a great debate here today, and I'd like to call upon the first speaker, please, to open the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, in 1970, in Canada, the government's response to the kidnappings of senior politicians by the FLQ, Front Liberation to Quebec, was to enact the War Measures Act, which arrested hundreds of suspected terrorists within hours of its enactment. Now, what this did was that it destroyed the terrorist group, and it was employed with practically no abuses. And the reason it worked was because it didn't infringe on the powers of Parliament or the ability of the press to monitor potential abuse. And for this reason, because we believe situations such as that in Canada are possible, this House believes that national security takes precedence over civil rights. Because national security must be the first role of the state, as its absence precludes all other goals. Throughout my speech, I will be talking to you about two things. How firstly, national security is a prerequisite for and prior to the guarantee of civil liberties. And how secondly, there is a balance of risk within our model that we need to address. And then Angela will talk to you about how this is only temporary in liberalism and how civil rights are not absolute, unlike human rights are. Now, before I move on to my constructive case, let me define the motion before us today. What we see national security being is the safety and protection of individuals and society from physical threats or harms. By taking precedence, we see that it is more important than, should be prioritized over civil rights, or justifies the restriction of taking away civil liberties. And what we define as civil rights is the rights and liberties accorded to a citizen of a democratic state. Let me move on to what our model in today's debate will be. Which liberties are we curtailing? We say these are due process laws of the criminal justice system, and these include arresting citizens without charge, detention without trial, and allowing police searches without warrants. If we do not see it necessary to implement all these measures, we do not need to. What we see is that we will implement what we see necessary. No, thank you, sir. Now, we would also like to limit freedom of assembly if we deem that it is necessary and if we deem that it will protect national security. Now let me just clarify some things. No, thank you, sir. Before I move on to my constructive case, we are not talking about the violation of human rights. We are only using this in cases of national security crises, ladies and gentlemen. That we are only going to use civil liberties we are only going to limit the use we are only going to limit civil liberties that we deem are directly relevant to the protection of national security. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are not advocating, no thank you sir, that the suspension of constitution or parliament. We are advocating anti-terrorist legislation and temporary national emergency powers. As an example, the Patriot Act in the USA. We accept that abuses may take case, ladies and gentlemen, but our burden in today's debate is to justify the prioritization of national security. And our goal is to revert back to the full protection of liberties, but we think that we are advocating temporary curtailment of liberties in times of crisis. Yes, sir.
Curtailment doesn't just imply abuse, it explicitly restricts and completely demolishes the right to habeas corpus and
okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We think that when there is no good outcome in increasing the civil liberties, we believe that we should not be giving civil liberties, because if they are not doing any good, if they are not protecting national security, we see no reason why we need to uphold them. Which brings me on to my final point about our model. We have 3 conditions for anti-terrorist legislation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these have been applied in most cases when emergency powers have been enacted, and we have seen that they have been successful. We're talking about anti-terrorist policy and implementation under the control of civil authorities, hence democratically accountable and not martial law. We are talking about times when special powers must be approved by Parliament only for a fixed and limited period of time, and they need to be reviewed on a minimum of an annual basis, and finally, that they should be clearly and simply drafted and published as widely as possible. So that's it. Let me finally move on to my constructive case, where I will explain to you firstly how national security is a prerequisite for and prior to the guarantee of civil liberties. We believe that this takes priority over civil liberties. No, thank you, because the state of nature is that people want protection, is that they feel that the first thing they care about as a human being is their safety and to be protected by society, which is why this system was created, where we have a state which is there to protect our interests and to make sure that no harm comes of us. Now, the only reason civil liberties were introduced is so that the government does not abuse these situations. So the first, what we tell you on side proposition is that the system, no thank you, was introduced to protect national security, and then they introduced a measure to safeguard against abuse. So that said, let me move on to how civil liberties, no thank you sir, are conditional. And we see this for 2 reasons. One, because of fear, because you cannot exercise your civil liberties in a state of complete and constant fear, which is why we believe national security and the feeling, no thank you sir, of safety comes straight before your enhancement of civil liberties. And we believe that secondly, as I have already touched upon answering Memos' point of information, when there is no good outcome, when civil liberties which have been implemented specifically to have an outcome do not have an outcome, we should not be enhancing them, no thank you, at the expense of national security. Which brings me on to my second argument, the balance of risk within our model. One side opposition will suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that they would prefer abuse by the government. But side proposition here today stands firmly in belief that we would rather be abused by the government than be abused by terrorists, which is what the opposition will suggest to you today. And we see this because the government is more predictable, it is more constrained, and it is more accountable to the people. Whereas terrorists are unpredictable, they are more violent, and they are more harmful. Which is why we see the difference being that in the opposition's model, what you do is that you accept hijacking of jumbo jets, whereas in the proposition's model, you accept that you might be jailed for 48 hours on suspicion of being a terrorist, which is why side proposition here today agrees that we would much rather suffer the abuse put forth by a government than suffer the abuse that we would have to put up with from terrorists if we were not protecting national security like our model suggests. So what have I told you today? Ladies and gentlemen, my constructive arguments have been that national security is a prerequisite for and comes prior to the guarantee of civil liberties. And secondly, that there is a balance of risk within our model. So for all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, and because national security must be the first role of the state, as its absence precludes all other goals, this House begs to propose. Ladies and gentlemen, a society which sacrifices liberty for security will get neither. And because of this, Side St. Catherine's are proud to oppose today's motions. Now, I will talk to you about why national security is in fact meaningless without having civil rights, and why this motion is dangerous and it will be abused. And my partner will then later explain how it in fact does not promote national security. But firstly, let's just talk briefly about what the proposition have said today. Firstly, we see that the proposition is burden shifting. They are promoting the status quo, and we feel that this is not what they should be doing on this situation. Secondly, they propose certain conditions, but we don't see what their justification for these conditions are. Thirdly, they said that this will only be temporary, but we say this will be entrenched, and so I'll show you my case. Fourthly, they say the absence of national security means that we cannot have civil rights. However, I will show you that national security and personal security are not the same thing. Fourthly, they imply detain without trial. That means they want a suspension of habeas corpus. That means they want a situation like Guantanamo Bay. No, thank you. Now, firstly, let me just clarify quickly. We're not proposing complete promotion of all rights under all circumstances. We're fine with airport security. No, thank you. We're fine with restricting people access to certain, secure information or secure locations. We were fine if you know about a specific terrorist attack to move people out of a building. What we are not fine with is this vague notion of we're going to be bombed at some point and therefore we must have a massive curtailing of people's civil rights. No, thank you. So let me first on to show you how national security is in fact meaningless without civil rights. Ladies and gentlemen, what we say is that firstly, rights are more important than security, and secondly, that security of the people is not equivalent to national security. No, thank you. Now, our civil rights are literally what makes us human. It's our right to dignity, our right to association, our right to movement is what gives our life meaning. And we say that the most secure form of living is if you live in a bunker, in isolation from all other people. But we say that people don't do this. And why do they not do this? Because every day people are willing to risk their own personal security so they can practice certain basic civil rights. We see that people regularly will sacrifice their lives, will risk their security for these civil rights. And we say that the idea that life is some absolute value that always takes precedence over civil rights was died when 11,000 people threw themselves into the firing line in Libya to protect their civil rights. However, ladies and gentlemen, even if we do assume that personal security is very important, we don't see how this is the same as national security, as I will move on into my second point. Now, ladies and gentlemen, national security implies security for the state. It means the state can operate without any threats. But this does not mean that the people are this way. For instance, China has incredibly good national security. However, its people live in fear of saying the wrong thing, of doing the wrong thing, of having their rights taken away. And so what we say is that while in the initial phases of curtailing civil liberties to gain national security, that it does equal personal security, we say that there is a point where it crosses the line and where national security is lost, and while personal security is lost and while national security is gained, and we say that today the proposition have crossed that line. Yes?
Don't you recognize that countries such as China do not have the necessary democratic institutions to maintain civil liberties, so there is no talk between national security and civil liberties, well, because there are no civil liberties to begin with.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we say is that it still demonstrates our point, that you can have that if you have complete national security, you can still have a person living in fear, and we don't see how this is a state protecting its citizens, which is what you're supposedly trying to do. Now let me talk to you about the dangers of this motion being abused by the government. And we
we say that the creation of an all-powerful state where people live more in fear of their state than they do in the fear of terrorist threat is actually quite minimal. What you create is this, no thank you, what you're essentially advocating the creation of is a state where people fear more that their state is going to detain them without trial, that their state is going to deny them the right to associate with other people because, thank you, because, and therefore they will feel that their state is a bigger threat to them than the minor terrorist threat, and we do not see that this situation is justified. And we see that creating this all-powerful state creates 4 major issues. And this is what I'll be talking about later, now thank you. Now essentially we say it creates issues with enforcements, it creates issues for the minorities, it creates issues with entrenchment, and it creates issues with the judiciary. Now let's talk about enforcement. We say that the government has a monopoly on legal violence. However, once you start stretching the boundaries of legality, you're essentially giving more and more power to the government. However, in the real world, what we have is a situation where these policies are enacted by people like policemen, like the army, like the special service. However, these people have more power under their motion, however, de facto are less accountable. And so therefore what we say is that these people are now being given rights to detain people without trial. And we say that this mainly happens, as we see in recent cases, to minorities. Now, what we see from recent examples is that laws also, again, and this is what brings me on to my second point, we say that these laws are mainly drafted that are specifically about minorities. We say that they specifically target minorities, and we say that to compound this problem, minorities are some of the weakest groups in our society. They're incredibly underrepresented, and they do not have the same ability to voice their complaints about these issues as other people do. Which brings me nicely on to my next point about entrenchment. Now, essentially, we say that this is not going to be a temporary measure. This is going to become entrenched in our legal system. So what we say is that part of this reason, and thank you, is, as I said earlier, that minorities have very little legal representation. There is no Muslim senator in the US. Secondly, what we say is that when a state creates a law that specifically targets a minority, the people of that state perceive that that minority is a threat, and therefore there will be no will to change that law because they perceive this threat. However, even if we were to assume that there were such goodwill, that what we say is that it's not going to come through. If you want to change a law, you have to go through debates, you have to go through judicial processes, you've created judicial precedents. It will be very hard to undo. And we also see that such laws are often politically motivated. Politicians rise to power to deal with some perceived terrorist threat. But what we say is that this law is not going to change by these politicians because they don't want to look like hypocrites. And we say this occurs particularly in this war on terror, as it is just an empty rhetorical phrase. There is no definite end to the war on terror, and therefore these laws will become entrenched in our legal system. And finally, we say that after 9/11, many civil rights were curtailed, and they still haven't come back 10 years later. Finally, let's look at the judiciary. The judiciary is the traditional check and balance for the executive and the legislative branches of our government. Now, by what they're doing is essentially taking some powers away from the judiciary and giving to the government under the stamp of civil rights. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that when you do that, you are curtailing the power of the judiciary. You are removing a check and balance for the legislative branch, and you're destroying on the basis that democracy is built on. In addition, in our criminal justice system, we work on a system of prosecution having the burden of proving guilt. We work on a system that we would rather have an innocent man walk free than a guilty man walk free than one innocent man put in jail. They're willing to put 100 innocent men in jail to catch potentially one guilty man. What we say is that the line between terrorism and crime is incredibly blurred, and we say that essentially what they're advocating doing is destroying all the basis of our judicial system for the past 400 years. So, ladies and gentlemen, because as society that sacrifices liberty for national security will get neither, this side proudly moves to propose. Thank you.
Honorable judges, worthy opponents, ladies and gentlemen, Today, we have a team opposition which does not understand the difference between civil rights and human rights. Today, we have a team opposition which seems to not understand that civil rights are attained after national security, because we cannot enjoy civil rights when we are fearing, ladies and gentlemen, our own lives. And we have a team proposition which believes that national security must be the first role of the state, as its absence precludes all other goals. And exactly because we believe this side of the House begs to propose the motion. In our first speech, we explained to you why national security is a prerequisite for and prior to the guarantee of civil liberties. And we explained to you how we balance the risks between abuse of government and abuse by terrorists, or other external threats or internal threats, and how our measure facilitates a better outcome. In my speech, I'll explain to you how we think temporary illiberalism is a good matter, because it guarantees future liberty, and I will also explain to you how civil rights are not absolute, unlike human rights. However, before I do so, let's have a look at what team opposition came up here and told us. No, thank you. They came up here and told us, ladies and gentlemen, that we're calling for the status quo. No, we're not calling for the status quo. Perhaps we are calling for the status quo, but what we're calling for, ladies and gentlemen, is a system which places the security of people over liberties, because we have governments debating this issue every single day. As war has changed, war is no longer conventional warfare between two armies, but rather it's a hidden warfare which relies on intelligence, which relies on finding out what terrorists are doing. And this calls for different measures and for a different approach to how we deal with this. Secondly, they told us that, no thank you, they came up here and told us that civil rights are what makes us human. And what they don't understand is that human rights are what makes us human, and that we are given human rights because we are human, but we are given civil rights because we are citizens of the state. And the state gives us these civil rights, and in the same way that it gives us these rights, it could take these rights away in order for the common good and the common collective. They never addressed this point because they had no response to this point. And then, ladies and gentlemen, they came up here and gave us this explanation, no thank you, that countries such as China forcibly focus on national security at the expense of civil rights. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that we're not debating about countries like China, because, well, countries like China don't care about civil rights in the first place. Countries like China don't have democratic institutions, and countries like China, well, if they don't have civil rights, civil liberties, then I guess there's nothing to debate about in China. Yes, please.
So you say that you would, what would you say, potential murders, suspected murders are not held in jail indefinitely. Why would you hold potential criminals?
Thank you. Your first speaker came up here and told us and said, we are not willing to detain 100 innocent people to catch one guilty person. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is we are willing to do this, because if that one guilty person is going to kill 3,000 people, if that one guilty person is going to hijack a plane and drive it into the World Trade Center, then it's our role and duty as a government to protect our society, and we accept that these costs exist, and we accept that we have to take a hard stance. But we also accept, ladies and gentlemen, that we must protect people, we must protect society, and we must be willing to take hard measures, because we do not live in the airy-fairy world that team opposition lives. We live in a world where we are under constant threat. We live in a world, ladies and gentlemen, in which government has to act in different ways. We live in a world in which government has to act in hard ways. But it's these hard ways which attain future liberty and future success, and that's exactly what we're going to argue, ladies and gentlemen. However, before I do so, let me just attack this final point, because they came up here and said that minorities are going to be attacked. And they came up and told us that minorities will feel like they're under pressure. No, thank you, sir. What we say is that these infringements on civil rights are not directly attacking minorities, they're for the general population. What we say is that politicians, when implementing these measures, must be clear and concise as to why they're doing this, as to not create this feeling of alienation. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that if the community feels so strong, no thank you, about being under attack, then they could seek representation, and they could seek legal means to find in their ways, because as a government, we do not accept illegal means and terror to hold our population hostage, ladies and gentlemen. What we believe in is a system which works for the people and for all the people, rather than allowing some people their rights in order to attack the rest of society. No, thank you. So now to my constructive case. We on team proposition believe that civil rights ebb and flow. And we say that civil rights are not fixed and they're not absolute. And we see this because over history we continuously infringe on civil rights in order to achieve a future grander goal. We see this in case of political instability. We see this in case of rapid industrialization, massive immigration, union extremism, even in economic busts and depressions. Herbert Hoover of the United States didn't let people take out money from their banks during the Great Depression in order to keep the banks safe, in order to keep the economic system of America safe. In a moment, sir. So what we say is that we weren't even allowing people to spend their own money in order to guarantee a common goal. So we think it's more important to guarantee people's lives so they can enjoy civil liberties in the future, ladies and gentlemen, please.
What do you have to say to the innocent Muslim who spent 8 years in Guantanamo Bay? Don't you think that is...
We're not calling for Guantanamo Bay. You obviously have not listened to what we said. Guantanamo Bay was an infringement on human rights. What we're calling for is the detainment of these people in order to find evidence, to make it much quicker and much more effective to find this evidence, because we don't have to go through 6 months judicial review. And that way, ladies and gentlemen, we get to foil terrorist plots. Because of some of the measures which the CIA in the United States has implemented, they've been able to foil 40 very dangerous suspected plots. And what we say is that we want more of that, ladies and gentlemen, because we think that we need more of this in order to guarantee the safety of society, in order to guarantee a society which can enjoy civil liberties in the future. So now back on this point of ebbing and flowing. What we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that even in peacetime, in the name of national security, we limit civil rights. And we do this through conscription. People like Dimitri Samouris had to go through 1 year, ladies and gentlemen, where they had to work in the army. And what was this? This was a restriction on his right of movement. This was a restriction on his right to do as he wished. And what we say is that we did this in order for national security, because we deem national security to be so important, because only through national security do we guarantee civil liberties. Only through national security do we guarantee a future in which the state and the people can live harmoniously, and we don't live under fear of under constant attack. And team opposition has to address this. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I kind of hinted at this throughout my speech, but we believe that temporary liberalism is acceptable. Why? Because strong countries with strong democratic institutions, and even countries with weak democratic institutions, always revert back to democracy, because that's the final aim, ladies and gentlemen. The final aim is to guarantee security so we can get back to democracy and get back to living a nice life, ladies and gentlemen. And what we say is that in the case of the United Kingdom, which had laws which restricted civil liberties, it repealed these laws this year because it no longer deemed terrorism to be as much of a threat. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that governments are capable of repealing these laws, and governments are very wise when it comes to repealing these laws. So basically, what have I come up here and show you today? I came up here and showed you that minorities aren't persecuted. I came up here and showed you that civil liberties are conditioned first on national security, because national security keeps you alive, and when you're alive, you can enjoy your civil liberties. And I also explained to you, ladies and gentlemen, how civil rights ebb and flow, and how the temporary liberalism is acceptable. And exactly because of these reasons, and exactly because of everything I've said, we beg to propose this motion.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would definitely not have national security precede civil rights, because a society that will sacrifice civil rights for national security will get none and deserves none. So, ladies and gentlemen, before I come and talk to you why their case is ineffective and actually exacerbates the problem, let me rebut the essence of the case brought forth by the proposition. The major point brought forth by the first speaker of the proposition was that civil rights are only there to maintain national security. Now, we heard this throughout the speech of the first debate of the side proposition. But what we see is that the side proposition is putting a case which has national security for the sake of national security. Now, they did not see, but by doing this, they in fact conceded that in a country where we have national security, that they believe that civil rights have to be sacrificed. So by doing this, what they in fact show is that during their case, the national security is not maintained, because in fact, civil rights no longer exist. No, thank you, sir. And then they talked to us about how having arrests without trial would in fact increase the efficiency of obtaining information. And yet they provided no link upon how this would happen. How exactly does gathering another 300-400 people who have minor suspicions, increasing the amount of information which one can achieve from them. They show no link to this, because the people who are suspicious and who we actually do have evidence, we already have the right to arrest. So what they're doing is in fact increasing the possibility to arrest people we don't even need to arrest, ladies and gentlemen. And then they talk to us, thank you, is about how it's better to have the government abusing the people rather than having terrorists abuse the people. Now, where exactly does this come from? Are you meant to get the people who are meant to be protecting you, who are meant to be, no, thank you, sir, who are meant to be protecting you from terrorists to actually be abusing you? So now instead of having only one abuser, you have two abusers. And then when they talk about abuse, what they actually insinuate, no thank you, sir, is that these people aren't even guilty. By saying that these people are being abused, what they're saying is that these people are in fact not correctly in jail and don't deserve to be in jail. No thank you, sir. But furthermore, what we saw in the definition was that they talked only about democracies. And the reason that they only talked about democracies, no thank you, madam, is because democracies have the checks and balances in which they can maintain that people aren't abused. But through their motion, what they do is in fact eliminate the checks and balances. Because what are the checks and balances? The checks and balances are the judiciary. The judiciary is what maintains that the executive, in other words the political groups, and the legislature don't abuse the people and don't abuse their control and their power. So what happens is when you take power away from the judiciary, you don't allow the judiciary to execute this check and balance. What in fact you do is you eliminate the need to have the democracies as the only place. So what they're trying to do is lighten their burden, but in fact they harm their own case. Yes, sir.
What we're saying is that we'd rather prefer governments having this ability, because governments are accountable to their people through election. So if governments do things that the people don't like, they can be taken away. Terrorists are not accountable.
How is a government going to be accountable when they can arrest people, not to tell anyone about how they've done this, abduct these people, as I quote, in the night? So what we see, no thank you, madam, is clearly that the government, how is the government accountable when they have the control to keep people quiet, to not have people tell other people of what they are doing, simply for the sake of national security? Now let me go on and talk about why their case is clearly ineffective. And we see that it deals with absolutely the wrong issues. Because the issues of why people end up with bombs in planes aren't that not enough people aren't being tapped by phones, but it's that airport security isn't good enough, or that the intelligence agencies aren't handling the information which they have correctly. So as we see an example of a Nigerian man who in 2010 managed to enter an airplane, what actually happened was Obama himself admitted that the reason why this happened is not that they didn't have enough information. It was that airport security was too inferior, that that it lacked in rigor, and actually that the CIA had mishandled information. And this also stands for 9/11. Because in 9/11 what happened is that the US government knew perfectly well what was coming. They knew that there was a threat. But what they didn't do was they didn't manage to handle the information that they had. They didn't manage to handle this information because in fact they weren't paying attention to what was the real problem, which was the prevention of danger when the danger comes, which was that, for example, ladies and gentlemen, that they had the information that the problem was coming. No, thank you, sir. But what they didn't manage to solve was the issues of being able to, in fact, take this threat seriously and deal with this problem when it came. No, thank you. But we see that they also exacerbate the problem, because a man who would normally cooperate with the government, a Pakistani man who, when he fears that when he goes back to his country and then when he returns, the government won't let him in because he possibly has a distant cousin who knows somebody who once met somebody who was part of Al-Qaeda, is much less likely to cooperate with the government, to possibly give information, if he knows that if he does this, what's happening is that they're going to indefinitely put him in jail, not allow him to exercise his rights, and allow him to actually protect himself in court. And we see that also the racial profiling and the marginalization which is put forth by the side of the proposition, in fact, leads to further extremism. And this can be seen in Sri Lanka, where the government was in fact racially profiling and was in fact abusing the civil rights of the Tamil people. And this was one of the major recruiting tools of the Tamil Tigers. who uses abuse and this marginalization within the people, of the people who felt marginalized by the government, not protected of the government, as one of the major tools for the people to fight back against them. And then we also see, ladies and gentlemen, that external intervention, which throughout the years has happened in places like Afghanistan, where people have been abducted, where people have been assassinated, has in fact been one of the major tools of Al-Qaeda for recruiting its troops. And in fact, the CIA reports every single year that this is one of the major issues, and which hasn't been treated with correctly. And in fact, we see how, until the side of the proposition can account to us whether they're okay with people being abducted and assassinated outside of the country, and whether this is any different, we don't see how their case stands. So ladies and gentlemen, because we definitely wouldn't have national security precede civil rights, because a society that will sacrifice civil rights for national security will get neither and deserves none. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we essentially just heard from their second speaker is that there isn't enough security checks at the airports. Is that because there aren't enough security checks at the airports, our liberties are at risk. And we say that that's exactly what we've been trying to tell you throughout this entire debate, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that this demonstrates that team opposition does not really understand their case, and that it's just the voice of Mr. Evans and Mr. Sadis coming through their arguments, ladies and gentlemen. And we say, and because national security must be the first role of a state, as its absence precludes all others, this side of the House believes that national security takes precedence over our civil rights. And you heard from Amy about why national security is a prerequisite for and prior to the guarantee of civil liberties. And she gave you a risk assessment of the issues that governmental abuse would incur, or the issues that the risk that terrorists pose. And you heard from Angelo about how this is temporary liberalism and how this is not absolute, like human rights. And I'm going to look at this debate, and I'll thank you, under two main questions. What are civil liberties, and where does the balance of priorities lie? So on this first, ladies and gentlemen, what are civil liberties? And what we said from the beginning of this debate is that civil liberties are those given to us by a democratic state. So any argument that they keep bringing up about China or anything else, no thank you, doesn't play a role in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, because that state doesn't respect the civil liberties that we're talking about and that we think democratic states guarantee their citizens. And what we said is that these civil liberties come from the state, is that civil liberties come when people form unions and groups becoming states and governments, because in the state of nature, you live in constant fear of harms that you can incur from others. And what we heard from team opposition was that, well, you actually in the state of fear is the safest state that you can ever be in, because, well, they didn't actually prove why. They just said the state of fear is the most dangerous place you can be in. And so when we enter into a state, when we enter into a government, when we enter into a contract with the government, ladies and gentlemen, they're in fact securing our rights because we're at risk, because we give up some of our liberties, and so they secure our rights. Which we say is exactly what we're trying to say, ladies and gentlemen. That you give up your liberties, and that when you give up your liberties, because you want someone to protect you, and to protect those exact liberties, ladies and gentlemen. And what we heard from team opposition in response, is that, well, you can still live in fear with national security. And again, they gave this example of China, which we say has no respect for civil rights and so doesn't play a role. And we say secondly, ladies and gentlemen, that these motions are temporary, and that this fear that people live in under the national by state intervention, no thank you, is by governmental abuse, will only last a fixed certain amount of time, and and is predictable, ladies and gentlemen, and that because of this, no thank you, and that because of this, ladies and gentlemen, and that because of this, we're justified in removing the civil rights, which are not immutable. And that's what they had to prove throughout this debate, in which they didn't prove, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, that civil rights are immutable. And this brings me on to my second question, the idea of the balance of priorities. And what we said is that the only thing you'll be giving up, generally, is the due process and the privacy that you have. And that we're not talking about human rights. And because human rights, ladies and gentlemen, are immutable, and human rights are given to you by virtue of the fact that you're a human being. And they brought up this example continuously of Guantanamo Bay, which was in fact the only example they brought up, except in China, and which is not valid, ladies and gentlemen, because we're not talking about human rights abuses, we're talking about detainment, we're talking about making due process and trial laws a little longer so that you can gather more evidence, and so that you can make sure you know who you're so you make sure you know who you're targeting. And they told us that, well, it's actually not fair because they told us that we accept airport security checks, which we say is a violation of your liberty, ladies and gentlemen. But they went on and told us that, well, you can't detain 100 people to find one person who is potentially a terrorist. And we say that war has changed, and that we've entered into a time in which there is asymmetric warfare, meaning that one person can potentially harm and kill 3,000 people with one single bomb, ladies and gentlemen. And because there is this danger that one person can pose, we are justified in limiting his civil liberties for a certain specific amount of time. And we brought to you the example of Canada. I'll take you in a moment. We brought to you the example of Canada, where a large number of individuals were detained, and few of them were actually few of them went through the process of the trial, and they were all released, and those that were found guilty were actually detained and put into jail, and they gave no response to this example.
Could you please supply the audience with an actual link of why being able to detain many, many more people who you have limited suspicion of will lead to the capture of a terrorist?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the simple link is that if you detain these people, you can understand, you can talk to them, you can search for evidence, and you can stop them from actually causing harm while they're in jail. I'd like some applause for that, Mr. Sanders. And we said furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, that the most important issue in this debate is that if you have to choose who it is that you're going to be abused by, we'd rather be abused by the state. And we heard actually no response the only response that we heard by this is that, well, you'll live in fear of the state. Which we say this fear is temporary, not like the protracted fear of terrorism, and we gave the example of Canada, which we heard no response to. And we say that furthermore, that the government can be held accountable for its actions, and that because of this accountability of the government, ladies and gentlemen, they can't do whatever they want after a certain amount of time once they return back to their liberal state of government, which Angela proved to you and we heard no response to. After they reach this, they will be held accountable if they do the wrong things to the wrong people, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that those wrong things like human rights, should not be done, and they were not in our model, and they were not outlined in our model. And so because of all of the above, we think that the balance of priorities lies in the fact that if you can detain certain terrorists and gain evidence and protect your individuals, then you're justified in doing so. And because civil rights are not immutable, you are justified in curtailing a few of them. Because of all of the above, this side of the House begs to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pretty sure that it was a pretty good idea of Samouris to make their case inclined to the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that we want the burden to be near the status quo so much that we're actually not really proposing any curtailment of civil rights, which means that we actually, at the end of the day, haven't proven how efficiency is the case for national security. I will be structuring my speech into 3 main questions. Firstly, do we achieve national security? Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, 2 main actually. Is it justified? So let's just jump into the first question, ladies and gentlemen, and I would like to clarify this messy debate. What are they saying they want to do? And they were very, very inconsistent. In their first speech, they said all these limits, all of these restrictions, typical, ladies and gentlemen, of their cases. And they said, ladies and gentlemen, okay, we want 6 months, we want only detainment of suspects, ladies and gentlemen, and we want, ladies and gentlemen, a short-term measure, which is only going to be applied for a short term. They didn't tell us how much time the government's going to apply this, ladies and gentlemen. So we contest every single criteria they came up with. So the most basic one was the short-term measure, which undermines the principle completely. Because we say, firstly, ladies and gentlemen, that it's easy a way out for politicians to just curtail and have this knee-jerk response to curtail civil rights and for an excuse and pretext for this national security. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the overwhelming majority of cases is not really immediately affected, so therefore it's much easier, ladies and gentlemen, for this to be established in the long term. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we think that politicians actually propose these measures, ladies and gentlemen, and exactly because the Republicans in the United States, ladies and gentlemen, don't want to look like fools, this won't be a short-term measure. They would want it to stay, want to be entrenched, even constitutionally. So basically, we're looking at something that becomes even worse. We're looking at a principle which just shifts more and more to a complete curtailment of human rights, which you want to uphold. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, let's see what outcome they want to create, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you, because they had this very nice example of Canada. So, ladies and gentlemen, if there is evidence, time, and location under the status quo, you can detain people. You are advocating through that example for the status quo. We think that founded evidence means that you can detain them. We mean that even if there's huge groups of people under the law, huge civil disobedience can actually be prosecuted legally. So you're not curtailing any civil rights or any civil liberties, ladies and gentlemen. You're just advocating. You want the whole cake and want to eat it all, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, sir.
You came up here and gave us an example. You said that you wouldn't want to try 100 people unjustly, something that would happen under our measures, if it found one guilty person. What we ask you and what we want an answer to is, why aren't you willing to do this to find the one guilty person who makes
You haven't proven us that he's, first of all, there's like an empirical efficiency, which I'm going to talk about now, that he's actually going to be guilty and that you're not going to sacrifice 4 years of a person sitting in a detained, which we actually think it's very, very kind of like wussy of you, if you excuse the term, to just say that we're not going to have Guantanamo Bay when you completely iron out the right of the person to be for his right to silence and his right to fair court. Corpus, whatever the name is, the Latin name is, which is the right, ladies and gentlemen, to this, completely implies that you have no check and balance about how these people in these 6 months will not be tortured. Yes, give me that. Not abducting people. How does judiciary law, when it says that we're abducting people with unfounded evidence, have any sort of difference with putting them in a room with no check and balance, which is actually what we want to have? How is it different? How are you preventing any type of rough interrogation? So, ladies and gentlemen, secondly, how they have not proven us or given us a causal link about how they increase national security. So let me ask you the second clash. How do they want... oh, no, sorry. Sorry. No, thank you. So,
Sir.
no, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, how are they not increasing security? So, essentially, ladies and gentlemen, they are curtailing, no, thank you, liberties, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of the day, behind all the frothy criteria that were contradicted in the second speech, they said, ladies and gentlemen, we asked the question, how do you actually catch a terrorist? We say, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, you're giving the checkmark to more unfounded arrests with no court procedure. So the cousin of the guy who had the links or some affiliation with Al-Qaeda is going to be prosecuted under your order, something that is empirically inefficient. We see under the Patriot Act student, no thank you, was detained for having an anti-Bush poster. We think that this is completely against the principles and completely against even him, the basic liberty of having, you know, a few months of detainment. That we think is very important. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, practicalities. The termination of the terrorists, ladies and gentlemen, means that all the jihad people who commit suicide in order to fight against the West will not just spill out information, and we think that they will just get rabble out of them, and in many cases misguided information, which will contribute to misallocation of resources, something that is completely inefficient. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, terrorists have safety mechanisms. That means they don't say their most important details to everyone, ladies and gentlemen. And that's exactly the case when the Nigerian guy who did the Christmas famous 2010 or 2011 bomb plot, ladies and gentlemen, didn't know any sensitive information. His whole interrogation and his lack of the whole interrogation procedure didn't have any outcome. So we think that the terrorists are smart enough to not just be telling everyone whatever. So, ladies and gentlemen, secondly and more importantly, the backlash and the counterproductiveness of this measure. We proved consistently throughout our case how, firstly, it exacerbates the problem. We saw, ladies and gentlemen, that internally, ladies and gentlemen, if you want, if someone gets kidnapped, he's marginalized, discriminated, and when the Tamil Tigers, ladies and gentlemen, we gave you the example of the Tamil Tigers where Muslims actually used this as a way to ramble out troops, ladies and gentlemen, against the West. We think it could raise polarization and a further backlash, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, even if we have national security, if we assume they have proven to us, we say that it's not the people's security. We prove that throughout our case. We gave you China, ladies and gentlemen, and we think that reverting back to the same undemocratic principles is exactly where they went wrong in this debate. The failure of the government to uphold basic security is the root of the problem. Let's fix the 9/11 planes which weren't flying correctly on 9/11, not prosecute people unlawfully. So lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we think it is justified because we think it is accountable to the people, because we say that the people don't support it at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. We showed you, ladies and gentlemen, how life is not an absolute value, and actually the liberty is what constitutes the value. And secondly, and most importantly, people don't actually know and aren't represented through this value, ladies and gentlemen, exactly because there exist minorities, and exactly, ladies and gentlemen, because people are through the night interrogated, taken away from their homes, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this is not a democratic state as they have conceded that they want to have. We say that exactly because of these, St. Catherine's begs to pose.
Ladies and gentlemen, when the proposition started this debate, their main aim was to prove how they were in fact improving national security. And that to improve national security, not only must one curtail civil rights, but it's also right to do so. Now they have failed on two accounts. Firstly, they have in no way proved how national security is actually obtained. And they haven't shown to us in any way how it is correct to curtail people's rights in favor of national security. Now let me start my reply, in which firstly I will talk about the principle of the debate, and secondly the practical aspects. Now we saw that the side of the proposition tried to put forth a case in which civil rights are simply there to ensure that people are alive. They're simply there to ensure that people can take the breath of their next day. They're not there to serve any role in the quality of life that these citizens are pursuing. They're not there to pursue the quality of life of the citizens within a country, that you feel safe within a country, that you feel that you can fulfill your role within a country without constant fear that the people who are meant to be protecting you, the government, is actually abusing you and trying to get you. But ladies and gentlemen, what actually happened was that they in fact completely conceded that individual security has absolutely no role. That people don't have to feel safe on an everyday basis, that they shouldn't care about how they themselves feel, that within a state they do feel that they are not safe, and that this is absolutely no important. And to this really, we had no response when we asked them this, because what they only said is that it's about the collective. It's about that we keep as many people alive. It's not about how these people are living. And then they tried to show us how national security is actually obtained. And they failed to prove this on so many accounts. Firstly, what we mainly heard, especially from the third speaker, was let's get lots of people in a room so that suddenly we can talk to them, because they'll want to discuss with us. Well, people who are so aggravated, people who want to, in fact, bomb your country, are much less likely to want to discuss with you, and are not likely, and especially if you have thousands of people who you want to interrogate, because you're freely arresting thousands of people, the likelihood of actually arriving to the truth is much smaller, and we proved to you this throughout the debate. And we also showed you how the key and the root to the problem isn't within people having too many civil rights, people being allowed to go freely on the streets, and people being able to exercise their right to protect themselves in a court. The problem is a lack of communication between agencies. A problem is that agencies aren't communicating, the information isn't used correctly. And what we also showed you is that they are in fact de-incentivizing improvement. And Memo showed you this throughout his case, how they're de-incentivizing improvement within these agencies, within the state, because in fact they're allowing the easy option for all politicians, for the executive power, to in fact infringe on people's rights more and more every single time that a new threat arises. And what they suddenly said is that by arresting thousands of Pakistani gentlemen and putting them within this closed room and asking them to talk, we are solving the issue. But we see that what they wanted to do is that what they tried to do from the beginning is lower their own burden, but because they know that the only possible way to get these people to talk is by torturing them. And they didn't want to actually talk about torture because they know that abusing people and taking away their civil rights is in essence wrong. But they also wanted to concede that they'll get information. And yet they tried to find the middle ground, which not only doesn't work in improving security, but still curtails people's rights and still undermines the value of people's lives. And so, ladies and gentlemen, when you try to sacrifice civil liberties in favor of national security, one doesn't get national security and one doesn't deserve it. We beg to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the final proposition speaker, I am here to set the opposition straight. Because Filippo's personal view is that unless you take up a life living in bunkers, you do not care about your life, and you do not care about national security, and you do not care about whether the government has the ability to save your life. Now, this is inherently untrue, as side proposition here today has proven to you, because we have told you that people care about their lives and that our model protects these lives, which is why I'm going to summarize this debate for you on two levels. Firstly, are civil liberties contingent on national security? Sorry, 3 levels. Secondly, what enhances national security? And thirdly, what is better for our society? In which we answer firmly our model. So, moving on to our first area of summary. Are civil liberties contingent on national security? To which side proposition answers firmly, yes they are. Because I explained to you throughout my whole first speech how we need national security and how the civil liberties are simply the safeguard from abuse to this factor. We heard absolutely nothing from side opposition about this. All we heard was a contradiction about increasing airport security, when in actual fact we don't care about security, we only care about civil liberties. Now, moving on to the second area, what enhances national security? Ladies and gentlemen, we heard from side opposition here today that it doesn't matter what enhances national security, because people who rebel in Syria don't care about their lives, because national security is for the sake of national security. Well, ladies and gentlemen, side proposition showed you today that we do have successful examples, that you can ask people in Canada, in the USA, in Italy, whether they are happy that our model has worked, and whether they are actually happy that we stopped terrorist attacks. We do not think their argument about this stands true, because we do think people value their lives and wish to protect them. Now moving on, they told us that we do not promote national security anyway, on which case side proposition argued firmly we do, because we get more leeway, we get more information, and we make our security better, for example. This model is inherently better, which is something the opposition ignored in today's debate, and we heard no actual analysis on why we are not actually promoting national security. Now, moving on to the final area. What is better for our society? What side proposition has come up to you with today, throughout this entire debate, is that we are balancing abuse, is that we accept that the system can open up for abuse. But if we have to choose between abuse coming from dangerous, violent terrorists, or abuse coming from our government, which is accountable to the people and can be changed by the people, we tell you that we prefer it coming from our government. Now, another thing we heard about this was that minorities are marginalized. And we tell you that no, we simply treat minorities as the suspects that they are, and even then we wish to protect the majority of our population who wish to live, even though they don't live in bunkers. So, ladies and gentlemen, moving on, they told us that we become entrenched, and that the system becomes entrenched, and it is the end of democracy. I asked them why they have not given us a single example of a situation in which this has happened, where we had a strong democratic country which stopped freedoms such as civil liberties and then did not actually revert back to democracy in the end of the day, as Angelo spent his entire speech explaining to you. And also, I gave an expiration date on these policies in my model in the first half minute of this debate. And finally, we heard about people not wanting to be abducted, in which case I tell you, I define this motion as due process laws and as limiting freedom of assembly, which is not abducting people. It is simply giving the government, giving people that extra leeway in which to carry out their measures and make sure that we catch the terrorists, which will protect the majority of society. So, ladies and gentlemen, for all the above, and because national security must be the first role of the state, as its absence precludes all other goals, this House begs to propose.